What if I told you that the state you're living in right now holds secrets that even the locals don't dare to speak of after dark? Delaware, the first state, the smallest state. But don't let its size fool you, because what happens in these quiet towns and forgotten roads is the kind of thing that will make you question everything you thought you knew about the place you call home. Tonight, I'm taking you on a journey through Delaware with 3 terrifying true stories. Stories that have never been fully explained. Stories that still keep witnesses awake at night even decades later. And I have to warn you, if you're watching this alone, you might want to turn on a few more lights, because by the time this video ends, you'll never look at Delaware the same way again. If you're ready, subscribe, hit that like button, and let's begin. Thank you. Into the darkness. Our first story takes us to the small town of Smyrna, Delaware, population just over 10,000, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where kids ride their bikes until the streetlights come on, and where nothing bad ever happens. At least that's what the residents believed until the fall of 1993. It was October. The leaves had turned that perfect shade of orange and red, and the air carried that familiar chill announcing the arrival of Halloween season. For the Patterson family, this should have been a time of celebration. They had just moved into their new home on Carter Road, a beautiful 2-story colonial house built in the early 1900s. The price had been almost too good to be true, but the realtor explained that the previous owners had moved away suddenly for work. The Pattersons didn't ask too many questions. They were just happy to finally have their dream home. The family consisted of David and Michelle Patterson, both in their mid-30s, and their 2 children, 8-year-old Emma and little Thomas, who had just turned 5. They were the picture of the American dream. David worked as an accountant in Wilmington, Michelle was a substitute teacher, and the kids were enrolled in the local elementary school. Everything was perfect for the first 2 weeks. It started with small things that could easily be explained away. Michelle would find kitchen cabinet doors open that she was certain she had closed. David would hear footsteps coming from upstairs when the entire family was gathered in the living room. Emma complained that someone was moving her dolls at night, arranging them in a circle facing her bed. And Thomas, sweet little Thomas, started talking about his new friend. Children always have imaginary friends. Every parent knows this. So when Thomas began mentioning someone named Mr. Hollow, David and Michelle didn't take it too seriously. Kids have active imaginations, especially at that age. But then Thomas started saying things that made Michelle's blood run cold. One evening, while Michelle was giving Thomas a bath, the little boy looked up at her with his innocent blue eyes and said, "Mommy, Mr. Hollow wants to know why you cry in the closet." Michelle froze. She had never told anyone, not even David, about her private moments of anxiety. When life's stress became too much, she would sometimes retreat to the walk-in closet in their bedroom, close the door, and let herself cry for a few minutes. She had never done this in front of the children. She had never done this when anyone was home. How could Thomas possibly know? She tried to laugh it off, asking Thomas what he meant. The boy just shrugged and said, "Mr. Hollow watches you. He watches all of us. He lives in the walls." That night, Michelle couldn't sleep. She lay in bed next to David, listening to every creak and groan of the old house. Around 3 in the morning, she heard something that made her heart stop. Scratching. A slow, deliberate scratching coming from inside the wall right next to her head. She woke David, but by the time he was awake enough to listen, the sound had stopped. He said it was probably mice or squirrels. Old houses get pests, nothing to worry about. But there was something to worry about. Over the following weeks, the scratching became a nightly occurrence. It would start around 3 in the morning and last for exactly 17 minutes. Michelle knew because she timed it, lying there in terror watching the clock on the nightstand. Always 17 minutes, never more, never less. And it wasn't random scratching like an animal would make. It was rhythmic, purposeful, almost like someone was trying to communicate. David finally agreed to call an exterminator. The man came on a gray Tuesday morning, inspected the walls, the attic, the basement, and found nothing. No droppings, no nests, no entry points. The house was clean. When Michelle told him about the scratching sounds, the man gave her a strange look and said something she would never forget. "Ma'am, I've been doing this for 22 years. I know what animals in walls sound like. What you're describing, that ain't no animal." Emma's behavior changed, too. The once cheerful, outgoing girl became withdrawn and quiet. She stopped playing with her friends, stopped doing her homework, stopped eating properly. When Michelle asked her what was wrong, Emma would just stare at the floor and say, "He doesn't want me to talk about it." When asked who, Emma would only say, "The man in the walls, the man with no face." If you're enjoying this story, hit the like button and subscribe. Now, I want you to pause for a moment and imagine this. You've just moved your family into the home you thought you'd live in forever. Your children are terrified of something you can't see. Your spouse is losing sleep every night, and you're starting to question your own sanity. What would you do? David Patterson found himself at exactly this point in November of 1993. He decided to take matters into his own hands. One Saturday morning, while Michelle took the kids to visit her mother, David went down to the basement and found the original blueprints of the house that the previous owners had left behind. He studied them carefully, comparing them to the actual layout of the home. And that's when he discovered something that changed everything. There was a room that didn't exist on any floor plan, that wasn't accessible from any door or hallway. According to David's measurements, there was a space approximately 8 feet by 6 feet between the master bedroom and Emma's room, a space that shouldn't exist according to the plans. David got his tools. He went to the wall in the master bedroom, the wall where Michelle heard the scratching every night, and he started cutting through the drywall. What he found behind that wall still haunts him to this day. The hidden room was real. It was small, dark, and smelled like something had died in there decades ago. But it wasn't empty. On the floor, arranged in a perfect circle, were 7 porcelain dolls. Old ones, maybe from the 1920s or 30s. They were all facing inward, toward the center of the circle. And in the center was a small wooden box. David's hands were trembling as he picked up the box. It was heavier than it looked. He opened it slowly, and inside he found a collection of items that made no sense. Children's teeth. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all different sizes. A lock of blonde hair tied with a red ribbon. And a photograph, faded and yellowed with age, showing a man standing in front of the very house David now owned. The man in the photograph had no face. It had been scratched out, violently, with something sharp. On the back of the photograph, in handwriting that looked like a child's, were the words, "Mr. Hollow keeps us forever." David called the police. They came, they investigated, they took the box and the dolls as evidence. A detective later told David that preliminary analysis suggested the teeth belonged to at least 15 different children. The photograph was dated 1927. There was no record of anyone named Hollow ever living in that house or in Smyrna. The case went cold almost immediately. The Pattersons moved out 3 days later. They left almost everything behind: furniture, clothes, memories. They just had to get out. Michelle later told her sister that on their last night in the house, she woke up at exactly 3 in the morning to find all 4 members of her family standing in the hallway outside the hidden room. None of them remembered getting out of bed. None of them remembered walking there. But they were all standing there, facing the wall, their hands pressed against it, as if listening to something on the other side. They never spoke about what happened in that house again. The property sat empty for 6 years before it was demolished in 1999. The lot still sits vacant today. Locals sometimes say that late at night you can still hear scratching coming from somewhere underground. 17 minutes of scratching, then silence. But here's the part of the story most people don't know. In 2015, a construction crew was hired to finally develop that empty lot. On the first day of excavation, they found something buried 13 feet below the surface. The same wooden box that David found in the hidden room. Inside were more teeth and another photograph of the faceless man. On the back, in the same childlike handwriting, Mr. Hollow never leaves. The development project was canceled. The lot was filled back in, and Smyrna, Delaware went on like nothing had happened. Because that's what small towns do. They bury their secrets. They pretend the darkness doesn't exist. But the darkness is always there, isn't it? Waiting, watching, living in the walls. If this story gave you chills, subscribe, hit that like button, and stay tuned, because our next story is even more disturbing. The second story takes place somewhere you might have driven past 100 times without ever knowing what horrors occurred there. Stay with me. We're continuing. Welcome back to part 2. We're continuing without slowing down. Now I'm going to take you to one of the darkest corners of Delaware. But first, let me say this. The story you just heard was only the beginning of what I'm going to tell you tonight. If Mr. Hollow disturbed you, brace yourself, because the story I'm about to tell involves one of the most unexplainable events in Delaware history. And this time, the witnesses weren't just one family. This time, an entire town experienced the horror. Our second story takes us to Frederica, a tiny town in Delaware's Kent County with a population barely exceeding 1,000. The kind of place you'd have trouble finding on a map. But in 1987, this small town became home to one of America's strangest and most terrifying events. An event that even today, the town's residents refuse to discuss with outsiders. It all started in March of that year. Winter had just ended, and the residents were waiting for the first signs of spring. But instead of spring, something else came to Frederica. The dogs noticed first. Every dog in town started barking at the same time, in the same direction, south, toward Killens Pond. No matter how much their owners tried to calm them, the dogs wouldn't stop. They barked for hours. Then, around midnight, they all went silent at the same moment, and that silence was far more unsettling than the barking. The next morning, one of the town's farmers, Harold Jennings, went to check his property near Killens Pond. What he saw there would haunt him for the rest of his life. On the muddy ground by the lake's edge, in perfect formation, lay hundreds of dead birds. Crows, sparrows, swallows, pigeons, every kind of bird, all arranged facing the same direction, toward the lake. And the strangest part was that none of them had any visible wounds, no predator marks, no damage. It was as if they had all fallen from the sky at the same moment, right at that exact spot. Harold immediately called the sheriff. Sheriff Douglas Carter was a man with 20 years of experience. He'd seen everything, but when he went to the lake that morning, for the first time in his life, he didn't know what to do. He counted the birds, exactly 333. 333 birds arranged in perfect rows, all looking at the same point, the center of the lake. Sheriff Carter called the state authorities. Environmental specialists came, veterinarians came, even federal agents came. Everyone was looking for an explanation. Poisoning? Disease? Chemical leak? Tests were conducted, water samples were taken, soil was analyzed, but nothing was found. The birds were completely healthy, except for the fact that they were dead. While the scientists scratched their heads, the town residents began forming their own theories. The elders remembered old stories, rumors of strange things happening at that same lake 100 years ago. But these were just rumors. No one took them seriously, until the second incident occurred. If you're enjoying this story, hit the like button and subscribe. Exactly 1 week after the bird deaths, on March 17th, the power went out in town. This wasn't unusual for Delaware. Storms, old infrastructure, all kinds of things could cause outages. But there was no storm that night. The sky was clear, the moon was shining, and it wasn't all of Frederica that lost power. Only the houses near the lake lost power. The other houses were working normally. One of the houses that lost power belonged to the Morrison family: Mother Patricia, Father Robert, and their 12-year-old son, Daniel. When the power went out, it was 11 at night. Patricia went to the kitchen to look for candles. Robert stood by the window watching outside. Daniel was in his room, sitting on his bed in the darkness. Robert said he saw movement outside the window, something coming from the direction of the lake. At first, he thought it was a light, a faint bluish glow, but the light wasn't moving, it was undulating, as if it were coming from beneath the water. Robert called his wife. Patricia saw it too. They both stood frozen in front of the window, watching that strange light. Then Daniel screamed. When the parents rushed to their son's room, they found Daniel backed into a corner. His eyes were wide open. He was pointing at the window, but there was nothing at the window, just darkness and moonlight. Daniel said, trembling, "A woman came from the lake. She looked through the window, but she had no eyes, just emptiness. And she was smiling, but her teeth weren't normal. She had too many teeth." Robert immediately went outside. With a flashlight in hand, he circled the house. In the soil beneath Daniel's window, he saw wet footprints, bare footprints, leading from the house toward the lake. But while there were prints going toward the lake, there were no prints coming from it, as if whatever it was had come from the lake, looked through the window, and then returned. But it had left no trace of how it got there. The next day, Robert Morrison went to the sheriff's office and reported what happened. Sheriff Carter took notes on what Robert had seen, but it was clear he wasn't taking it seriously. "Kid's imagination," he said. "Shadows in the dark play tricks on people." But Robert wasn't the only one who came to the sheriff's office that day. That same night, 4 different families from 4 different houses around the lake reported almost the same thing: a bluish light coming from the lake, a figure standing outside their windows, a woman with no eyes, and that strange too many teeth smile. 4 families, 4 different houses, 4 identical stories, and none of them knew each other. Sheriff Carter could no longer ignore this, but what could he do? Search for a woman with no eyes? Dive into the lake and find someone underwater? None of this made sense. Nothing made sense. But the events didn't stop. On March 24th, the town's grocer, Eddie Thompson, disappeared while taking an early morning walk by the lake. When his wife called the sheriff around noon, Eddie had been missing for 4 hours. Search parties were formed. Volunteers scoured the area around the lake. Divers searched underwater. No trace of Eddie was found. 3 days later, Eddie's body was found at the lake's edge, in the exact spot where the birds had been found dead. But Eddie's body wasn't normal. His face bore a frozen expression, something beyond fear, absolute terror. His eyes were wide open, and his mouth was open too, but his tongue was gone. It hadn't been cut, it hadn't been torn, it was just gone, as if it had never existed. The autopsy report couldn't explain anything. Cause of death remained undetermined. It could have been cardiac arrest, but his heart was completely healthy. It could have been drowning, but there was no water in his lungs. The tongue matter baffled the medical community. There was no sign of surgical intervention, no scarring. The tongue had simply vanished. Eddie's funeral drew a large crowd in town. Everyone was there, and during the funeral service, everyone noticed the same thing, that faint bluish light coming from the direction of the lake, in broad daylight, with the sun overhead. Everyone saw it, and everyone heard it, a sound coming from beneath the water, like whispering, but the words were unintelligible, just sound, hundreds of whispers all at once. The funeral was cut short. People fled to their homes, and from that night on, no one in Frederica went outside after dark. Windows were shut, curtains were drawn, and everyone waited, without knowing what they were waiting for. At the beginning of April, the events seemed to have stopped. The light didn't appear. The figure didn't appear. The town slowly began returning to normal. People started talking again, laughing again. Maybe it was all over. Maybe it had just been a strange series of coincidences. But on April 13th, 12-year-old Daniel Morrison confessed something to his family. He said the woman from the lake had been coming to his window every night, every single night, and every night she was getting a little closer. The first night, she was at the edge of the yard. The second night, she was beside the house. The third night, she was just outside the window. And for the past several nights, the woman had been trying to get inside. Daniel could show them the fingerprints on the glass. Fingerprints pressed from the outside, not the inside. But the fingerprints had no skin, just bone, just white bone prints. The Morrison family left Frederica that night. They left Delaware. They left the East Coast. They moved to Arizona, to the desert, as far as possible from any body of water. Patricia Morrison said the following in an interview with a journalist years later. That thing, whatever it was connected to the water. It lived in the lake, or somewhere beneath the lake, and it wanted my son. I don't know why, but it wanted him, and if we hadn't run, it would have taken him. Daniel Morrison is a man in his 40s today. He never married, he never had children, and he never, not even for a single night, stayed anywhere near water. His friends think he has a strange phobia, but Daniel knows the truth. This isn't a phobia, this is survival instinct. Killens Pond is one of Delaware's most popular recreation areas today. Every summer, thousands of people swim there, camp there, have picnics there, and none of them know what happened in the spring of 1987. Because after those events, the town made an agreement, a silent agreement. No one would speak of it. No one would remember. Frederica buried its secrets. But secrets don't stay buried. They always find a way to surface. Just like that bluish light, just like that woman with no eyes. According to local legend, every 33 years, the woman returns. In 1954, a child disappeared in the lake, and the body was never found. In 1987, Eddie Thompson died, and Daniel Morrison was marked forever. And if the calculations are correct, the next return should have been in 2020. Interestingly, in 2020, 3 separate missing person cases were reported around Killens Pond. All 3 were found, but all 3 said the same thing, that they saw a bluish light in the lake, and that they saw a woman's face beneath the water, with no eyes, smiling, calling to them. Authorities explained this as mass hysteria. Maybe it was. Maybe people had heard the old stories, and their minds showed them things that weren't there. That's a logical explanation, a comforting explanation. But the elders of Frederica think differently. They know there's something in that lake. It was always there, and it always will be. If you ever visit Killens Pond and decide to spend the night there, I have some advice for you. Don't look at your window. Don't go near the water's edge. And if you see a bluish light, don't approach it, because that light might be calling you. And if you answer its call, you might never come back. Now catch your breath. Take a deep breath, because our third and final story contains the kind of horror that will haunt your nightmares. But before we get to it, if you've enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that like button. Show the algorithm that you love this kind of content, and write in the comments any scary stories you've heard about Delaware. Who knows, maybe your story will be the subject of our next video. Now let's move on to our final story. Buckle up tight. Now we've arrived at the final part and the last story of tonight. I have to be honest with you. While researching this story, I had to stop several times. I got up from my computer, I'd paced around my room, I looked out the window, because this story is different from the others. This story doesn't just have unexplainable events. In this story, we confront the darkest side of humanity. And the most terrifying part is that the protagonist of this story is still alive. She still lives in Delaware, and every night she still has the same nightmare. Our third story takes us to Woodland, a community in Delaware's Sussex County, with a population of only a few hundred people. This place doesn't even count as a real town. It's more like a few dozen houses scattered throughout the woods. People live in isolation here. They see their neighbors once a month, and everyone minds their own business. Until 1998. The most exciting thing you could say about Woodland was the small harvest festival held every October. But in December of that year, Woodland turned into a living hell. At the center of our story is the Whitmore Farm, a large piece of land that had belonged to the same family for 5 generations. In 1998, the farm was operated by Thomas Whitmore and his family. Thomas was 52 years old, a rough-looking but soft-hearted man. His wife Eleanor was 48 and one of the town's few teachers. They had 2 children. Their 23-year-old son, James, worked on the farm with his father, and their 17-year-old daughter, Sarah, was a high school senior. They were a typical American rural family, hardworking, honest, close-knit people. It all started on December 12th. That day, Thomas had gone to the most remote part of the farm. There was an old barn there, a structure no longer in use, left to rot. Thomas was planning to demolish the barn and build a new storage facility in its place. But that day, when he entered the barn, he found something that changed his plans. On the barn floor, beneath the hay bales, there was a hatch, a wooden hatch. Thomas had been born on that farm. He knew every inch of it, but he had never seen this hatch. Curious, he opened it and looked down. A dark void, a ladder, and cold, damp air coming from below. Thomas grabbed his flashlight and climbed down the ladder. What he found below was a tunnel system, hand-dug, earthen tunnels going in 3 different directions. The walls were reinforced with stone. This was professional work, and it was very old. Thomas followed one of the tunnels. After about 100 meters, he reached a room. If you're enjoying this story, subscribe and hit that like button. The room was square-shaped. There were shelves on the walls, and on the shelves there were jars, dozens of jars. When Thomas got closer, he saw what was inside the jars, and for the first time in his life as a grown man, he screamed. Inside the jars were human organs, preserved in formaldehyde, still recognizable despite the passage of years. Hearts, kidneys, eyes, and most horrifying of all, small hands, children's hands. Dozens of children's hands, each in a separate jar, lined up in rows. Thomas fled the tunnel in panic. He ran to the house. He called the sheriff. Within an hour, the farm was filled with police vehicles. Detectives, forensic experts, even FBI agents arrived, because this wasn't an ordinary murder. This was a serial killer case, and the number of victims was far beyond what anyone could have guessed. It took days to explore the entire tunnel system. They found a total of 7 different rooms. Each room contained different things. One had organs, one had bones, one had clothing, one had toys, and in the last room, a journal filled with handwriting, hundreds of pages long. The journal dated back to the 1870s, and it wasn't written by a single person. It had been written by different members of the Whitmore family across generations: grandfather, father, son, grandson. 4 generations of Whitmore men had carried on the same tradition, and that tradition was kidnapping and killing children. As Thomas Whitmore read the journal, he confronted his own family's history. His great-great-grandfather, Ezra Whitmore, had killed his first victim in 1873, a 7-year-old girl, reported missing, never found. Ezra had written in the journal, "God gave me a mission to collect the innocent, to save their souls, to protect them from the darkness." This was the rambling of a madman, but Ezra wasn't the only one who was mad. His son Nathaniel had continued the tradition, and so had his son William, and William's son George, Thomas's father. Thomas's loving, compassionate father who had always treated him well. George Whitmore had killed at least 17 children from 1950 to 1982. Thomas collapsed. He physically collapsed to the ground. Everything he knew, everything he believed, everything he loved was a lie. His father was a monster. His grandfather was a monster. And perhaps the same darkness ran through his own blood. The investigation lasted months. The remains in the tunnels were analyzed, DNA tests were conducted, and the results were horrifying. Over more than 120 years, at least 43 children had died on the Whitmore farm. 43 innocent children, and none of them had ever been found. Their families had never learned what happened to them, until now. But the story doesn't end here, because during the investigation, detectives began asking a disturbing question. The tradition had continued for 4 generations. George Whitmore had died in 1992, 6 years earlier. Had the tunnels gone unused during those 6 years, or was there a 5th generation? Thomas's son James was brought in for questioning. The 23-year-old young man was interrogated for hours, and finally he confessed. Yes, his grandfather George had told him everything before he died. The tradition, the mission, the family legacy. And James had fulfilled his grandfather's final wish. In 1994, 96, and 98, he had killed 3 children. His most recent victim had been just 3 weeks ago. The day Thomas Whitmore learned his son was a killer, he felt as if a knife had been plunged into his heart. His own blood, his own son. He had held that little boy in his arms. He had watched his first steps. He had taught him to ride a bike. And all that time, a monster had been growing inside him. James Whitmore was arrested and tried. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences without parole. In court, he showed no remorse. He only said this: "It was my family duty. It's in our blood. It was inevitable." But the most heartbreaking part of this story is Sarah Whitmore's story. The 17-year-old girl was completely unaware of her family's horrific secret. Overnight, she went from being a member of a loving family to being the daughter of a serial killer family. She couldn't go to school anymore. Her friends refused to speak to her. The townspeople called her killer's spawn. Sarah stayed in Delaware. She didn't run, she didn't change her name. She chose to face it. Today, she's a 43-year-old woman. She works for a charity organization, an organization that helps find missing children. She has dedicated her life to rebuilding what her family destroyed. A documentary filmmaker interviewed Sarah a few years ago. In that interview, Sarah said the following: "I have the same nightmare every night. I'm in the tunnels, I'm walking in the darkness, and I hear footsteps behind me. When I turn around, I see my father, my grandfather, my great-grandfather. They're all smiling, and they say to me, 'Your turn will come too.' That's when I wake up, drenched in sweat, screaming, and I ask myself, is this just a nightmare, or is that darkness really inside me?" The Whitmore farm was demolished in 1999. The land was declared state property. Nothing was built on it. The tunnels were filled with concrete, and officially, the Whitmore case was closed. But the elders of Sussex County say different things. They claim that on some nights, lights can be seen where the farm used to be. Small, flickering lights, as if someone is walking around with a lantern. And some say that on nights when the wind blows just right, they can hear sounds coming from beneath the earth. Children's voices, crying sounds, screams for help. Science cannot explain this. Logic rejects it. But 43 children lost their lives beneath that soil. 43 innocent souls that never found peace. And perhaps, just perhaps, they're still there, still waiting for someone to find them, for someone to tell their stories. That's what we did tonight. We told their stories. We brought Delaware's dark secrets to light. We spoke of Mr. Hollow. We spoke of the eyeless woman of Killens Pond, and we spoke of the Whitmore family's generational horror. These stories are real, these places are real, and that darkness is still out there somewhere, waiting. So, what happens now? When you finish watching this video, you'll turn off the lights and try to sleep. But when you close your eyes, you'll think about these stories. You'll listen for sounds coming from your walls. You'll look at your windows, and you'll ask yourself, what if these aren't just stories? What if there really is something in the darkness? I'll leave you with that thought. But before I go, I want to make you a promise. This channel will continue to investigate the darkest, most terrifying, most unexplainable stories of Delaware and America. A new horror every week, a new mystery every week. And if you want to join me on this journey, all you have to do is subscribe. See you in the next video. Keep the lights on, and remember, something is always watching in the darkness. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button, subscribe to my channel, and write in the comments which state stories you'd like to hear. Take care of yourselves, and goodbye.